You boys got 30 seconds to move that truck or I'm dragging it into the creek. That's what Grandpa said. Not shouted, not warned, just said it, like he was commenting on the weather. Cigarette resting between two calloused fingers. His boot grinding a line into the dirt like a fuse. The man in aviators blinked like the sun had just caught him wrong, glanced at his clipboard like it held the secret to survival, and let out a half laugh. The kind of laugh that floats up like a balloon right before it gets shot down. I didn't laugh, I didn't breathe, because I'd seen that look in Grandpa's eyes before. The look that didn't blink, didn't budge, didn't care what the world thought was proper. And when he turned away and headed for the old Chevy tow rig by the barn, I knew something had just crossed a line. But that wasn't where the story began. No, it started a couple mornings back, when the only thing louder than the cicadas was Grandpa's radio blaring Merle Haggard out the barn window. I was out by the south pasture, helping mend a stretch of fence the wind had chewed up last week. The air was thick with heat and hay dust, and Grandpa was whistling some tune about whiskey and rain. It was peaceful. That kind of quiet hum you only get when nature and man have reached a truce. That's when we saw it. Dust, high on the ridge road, rising in a plume that shimmered like smoke. We both froze, the way animals do when something's off. Grandpa narrowed his eyes under that old hat he always wore, the one stained with sweat and stubbornness, and tilted his head just slightly. That wasn't one of ours, he muttered. It wasn't a delivery either. The vehicle that crested the hill wasn't like the battered trucks we drove or the mud-splattered Jeeps of our neighbors. This one gleamed. White, spotless, like it had never tasted gravel. Its tires rolled too smooth. And the decals on the side, HOA Patrol, magnetic, cheap, block letters with no authority, no seal, no soul, just pretend power, slapped on like a costume the night before Halloween. The truck rolled straight past the private property sign nailed to our split-rail fence, ignored the chain cattle gate entirely, and pulled up into the barn lot like it belonged there, like it had the right, like we were the ones trespassing on our own land. Two men got out. The first one young, maybe 20, looked like he'd been folded straight out of a mall display. His khaki had creases. For God's sake. The second one was older, built like a stick of celery left too long in the sun. Aviator sunglasses. Clipboard clutched to his chest like it granted him divine jurisdiction. They didn't say anything at first, just looked around, nodding to themselves. The older one pointed toward the hay trailer, jotted something down. The younger one stared at the barn cat sunning itself near the trough like he wasn't sure if it belonged to wildlife or us. Grandpa didn't move right away. He just stubbed out a cigarette on the heel of his boot and dusted his hands off on his jeans. I already knew what was coming. I'd seen it too many times. People with papers and plastic titles, marching out here like the dirt had to explain itself to them. Grandpa walked with that deliberate slowness that always made time feel heavier. Not angry, not rushed, just measured, like each step carried the weight of generations. I followed, not because he needed backup, he never did, but because I wasn't about to miss what was about to go down. "Can I help you?" Grandpa asked. Voice low but coated in gravel, the kind of voice that rumbled more than it spoke. Clipboard straightened his back, adjusted his sunglasses. "We've received reports of unauthorized equipment storage and potential zoning violations. We're with Riverbend HOA Expansion Enforcement. Routine compliance sweep. Nothing to worry about." He spoke like he'd practiced the script in front of a mirror. And maybe he had. Maybe he thought it would work out here like it worked in subdivisions and cul-de-sacs where people followed rules printed on laminated cards. Grandpa didn't blink, didn't answer. Just turned slightly and thumbed back at the old tow truck. Its rust streaked like war paint, the chain hanging from the back like a tail. 30 seconds, he said, flat, no threat in his tone, no rise in volume, just a statement. 30 seconds or it goes swimming. The younger guy let out a nervous chuckle, the kind that dies in the air before it lands. Clipboard scoffed, muttered something about regional cooperation and land ordinances. Grandpa wasn't listening. He was already walking. The moment he turned his back on them, the atmosphere shifted, like air pressure before a storm. Even the cicadas paused. That old Chevy hadn't started that fast in years, but it turned over like it knew it had a job to do. Diesel grumbled awake. The tow hook clanged against the bumper as Grandpa threw it into reverse, and I realized, watching the clipboard guy's jaw drop open, that we weren't in a negotiation, that we were in a reckoning. You ever see a man realize he brought a pencil to a gunfight? That was him, flinching but frozen, waving his arms, yelling something about legal recourse. Grandpa never looked at him, just climbed out, hauled the chain back, and hooked it to the gleaming bumper like he was tying down a hay bale. I'd seen him move faster, but never with more purpose. And that's when it clicked. This wasn't about one truck. This was about something bigger. A line had been crossed. A quiet war had been declared. And Grandpa, he'd been waiting for it. Waiting for the day someone with soft hands and soft words came onto his land, pretending a magnet on a door was stronger than the rust in our blood. The truck gave a shudder as the chain snapped tight. Tires screeched against gravel. Clipboard shouted. The younger one tried to run after it, but the momentum had spoken, and Grandpa, he never once looked back. The chain snapped tight like a loaded sentence, and the fake HOA truck jerked backward with a mechanical groan that echoed off the barn walls. Gravel spat in every direction. Clipboard guy finally snapped out of his bureaucratic trance and lunged forward, one hand reaching for the truck's door handle, the other still clutching that clipboard like a life vest on a sinking ship. But it was too late. Grandpa had already stepped on the gas. The old Chevy surged forward, dragging the pristine white truck like a rebellious child being hauled out of church by the ear. The young guy shouted something, maybe, "Wait or you can't," but the tires were already chewing up the pasture, throwing mud and pride into the air. I didn't follow. I just stood there in the barn lot, stunned, heart pounding with something that felt half like fear, half like victory. That truck bounced behind Grandpa's tow rig like it had just realized it made a grave mistake, metal groaning in protest. The slope behind the pasture dropped off into a shallow creek, a muddy, slow-moving cut through the land that had seen more honest labor than any HOA committee ever would. Grandpa didn't rush. He didn't need to. The land had already done half the job. After spring rains, the incline was slick and soft, perfect for teaching unwelcome visitors a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. He reached the edge, braked just long enough to angle the swing, then hit the release. The chain snapped free with a sharp metallic clunk, and gravity took over. The truck coasted forward, tires locked, then slipped, skidded, and finally dropped nose first into the creek bed. Water splashed, mud exploded outward, and for a second, the truck just sat there, engine silent, like it had given up. From the top of the hill, Clipboard guy just stood in stunned silence. Glasses gone, socks soaked, and the kind of shell-shocked stillness you see on a man who realizes he's no longer in control of the situation. Grandpa stepped out of the tow truck like a man walking away from a sermon he'd just preached. "You can tow it out yourself," he said, voice calm, cigarette lit like punctuation. "But next time, bring a real badge." I was halfway to passing out from laughter. The tension broke like a dam. I couldn't breathe. It was the most beautiful, chaotic thing I'd ever seen, a perfect rebellion in one motion. The younger guy was fumbling with his phone, probably trying to record the aftermath, but Grandpa was already a step ahead. He snapped a photo of the truck nose deep in creek mud and calmly dialed the sheriff. "Got a couple trespassers out here claiming to be HOA," he said into the receiver. "Might want to come check their paperwork before I toss the clipboard into the river." That line alone could have sold tickets. But Grandpa wasn't done. He stayed up at the top of the hill, arms folded, watching the two men squirm. The truck wasn't going anywhere, and neither were they. 15 minutes later, a sheriff's cruiser rolled up the drive. No lights, no siren, just the slow, quiet authority of someone who already knew what kind of mess they were walking into. Deputy Keller stepped out, glanced at Grandpa, then sighed the way you do when you see a familiar dog at the scene of a familiar crime. Let me guess, he said, walking toward the edge of the hill, eyeing the truck half submerged below. Didn't read the sign. Didn't read much of anything, Grandpa replied, handing him a towel from the horse trough. Keller smirked, walked over to Clipboard, now looking like a cat pulled from a flooded basement, and asked for ID. That's when the mask fully slipped. Clipboard guy fumbled in his wet pocket and pulled out a bent laminated card, the kind you'd expect from a middle school library. Not a governing authority. It looked like it had been printed on a home printer running low on ink. Keller didn't even take it at first. He just stared at it, then at the man, as if offering him one last chance to backpedal. No luck. The man insisted he was a compliance observer with the Riverbend Expansion Division. That's funny, Keller said dryly, finally slipping the card into his notebook. Because there ain't no such registered HOA in this county. And even if there was, it wouldn't give you the right to enter private land, much less park on it. Clipboard guy stammered, spit out a salad of buzzwords: regional ordinance, zoning jurisdiction, scouting initiative. It all dissolved like tissue in rain. Meanwhile, Grandpa had wandered over to the back of the truck and popped the hatch. Inside were a few crumpled paper folders, a walkie-talkie, and a stack of community notices printed on cheap paper with a logo I'd never seen before. The sheriff pulled on gloves and sifted through the mess. That's when things took a darker turn. He pulled out a folded map, a development schematic. Handwritten notes littered the margins. Water access, zoning dispute, non-compliant acreage. A bright red circle marked our creek. A bright green swath marked a future development labeled Phase 1, Fibons. There was even a line drawn straight from our water source to a site across the hill. This isn't a compliance map, Keller muttered. This is a claim. I figured as much when he parked on my hay, Grandpa said. Keller called for backup and zoning enforcement. He turned to the younger guy, who'd been oddly silent, wringing his hands by the fence line. You involved in this? I just ride along sometimes. The kid stammered. My uncle said it was part of a new property group. I didn't know it was illegal. Who's your uncle? Keller asked. Voice low. Frank Davidson. The kid replied. The name landed like a dropped hammer. I saw Grandpa's eyebrow twitch. Davidson's smug land developer, owner of that glass monstrosity near the lake. The man who once called ranchers inefficient landholders at a zoning meeting and almost got decked by Grandpa for it. And now his nephew was here, standing in our field, drenched in guilt and mosquito bites. Keller nodded slowly and stepped away to make a call. I knew exactly who was on the other end of that line. Davidson wasn't just scouting land. He was laying quiet groundwork for a land grab through manipulation, forged documents, and plastic authority. But now his game had been dragged into the open by the worst possible opponent, a man too old to be threatened, too stubborn to be bought, and too prepared to be surprised. As the tow crew finally arrived to extract the truck from its muddy grave, Clipboard sat silent on a bucket by the fence, staring at the creek like it had betrayed him. He didn't argue, didn't demand damages. He just sat there, soaked and broken, watching his ambitions get reeled in on a steel cable. The sheriff didn't cuff him, but the look he gave was worse. A quiet, certain promise that the next step wasn't going to be as gentle. Meanwhile, Grandpa lit another cigarette and leaned against a post like he'd just finished a slow afternoon chore. Should have brought waiters, he muttered. City folk always forget the creek bites back. The truck was gone by sunset, hauled out by a groaning county winch crew who looked like they'd rather be doing anything else than dragging a lie out of the mud. The tires left twin ruts that ran like scars through the pasture grass, and the water in the creek swirled dark for hours afterward, as if it, too, had to recover from the intrusion. Grandpa didn't speak much that evening. He sat on the porch with his boots off, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him, staring out toward the tree line where the whole thing had played out. I sat next to him in silence, unsure if he was brooding or calculating, knowing Grandpa, probably both. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness you only get after something old and patient has been disturbed. The next morning, before the rooster even cleared its throat, Grandpa was already out walking the perimeter of the lower pasture with a pair of binoculars slung around his neck and a battered field notebook in hand. He wasn't just checking the fence. He was studying the land like it had whispered something in the night. I followed behind, boots crunching in dew-soaked grass, trying to keep up. When he stopped suddenly, crouching near the bend in the creek, I almost walked into him. "Look," he said, not looking at me but pointing at the ground. There, sticking out of the mud like crooked teeth, were painted wooden stakes. Orange survey tape fluttered off each one like a warning flag. They were evenly spaced, driven deep, and marked with barcodes and a stylized company logo I didn't recognize. Grandpa pulled one out with a grunt and turned it over in his hands. "These ain't from no random HOA clown," he said. "These are developer tags. They've been out here longer than yesterday." That's when I realized the truck hadn't been the beginning. It was a middle move in a game we hadn't realized we were playing. And Davidson, he'd already made the opening plays. We spent the rest of the morning following those stakes, tracing them like a trail of breadcrumbs through the back acres. They cut through the tree line, down the slope, and right to a soft patch of earth near the creek's narrowest point, a natural funnel where water pooled shallow and the bank sloped just enough to suggest dig here. It was the kind of spot someone might choose if they were quietly planning to reroute something. Grandpa stood there a long time, silent, then drove the toe of his boot into the mud. "Too quiet," he muttered. "Too convenient." Back at the house, he pulled a dusty plastic storage box out from the hallway closet. Inside were deeds, old water rights, topographical maps, and one thick folder marked in fading Sharpie Federal, "Do not lose." He spread them out on the dining table, one hand on a mug of black coffee, the other flipping through pages with the focus of a man who knew exactly what to look for. When he found it, he didn't say a word. He just nodded to himself, tapped the edge of a parchment yellow document, and pointed to a line near the bottom. "Here, 1962, protected riparian corridor. This land's got water rights older than the zoning office itself." It wasn't just a matter of trespassing anymore. Anyone planning to cut into the creek would be violating federal protections tied to historical use. Grandpa's father had registered the rights when the county still used typewriters. That meant Davidson wasn't just an ambitious developer, he was a snake banking on the idea that nobody would remember what the land was entitled to. That afternoon, we drove into town, past the gas station with the broken sign, down to the zoning office. Grandpa didn't speak to the receptionist. He didn't ask for a form or wait in line. He marched straight back to the planning desk and slapped one of the wooden stakes on the counter in front of a startled clerk. She blinked, adjusted her glasses, and opened her mouth to ask a question, but he was already unfolding the map we'd found in the HOA truck. "Why is a land development company placing unauthorized markers across my creek?" he asked, slow and sharp. "And why does this map have my ranch marked in red, with a pipeline drawn straight through it?" The clerk blinked again, this time slower, and started typing. A moment later, she paused. "That wasn't filed through our office," she said carefully. "It looks like a third-party contractor submission unapproved. The listed entity is Davidson Land and Water Solutions. It's a registered subsidiary." Grandpa didn't flinch. He just looked at me. Same name as the kid by the fence. Same man who tried to pave the lakefront with glass and chrome. I added, outside, the sun had turned hot and bright, but the sky felt tighter, more crowded somehow. Grandpa stopped by the feed store on the way home and picked up 10 more rolls of fencing wire and a box of trail cams. That evening, as shadows stretched long across the pasture, we set up one of the cameras overlooking the stake line near the creek. Grandpa had noticed faint tire tracks leading to one of the deeper banks, tracks we hadn't made. "If they come back," he said, "we're catching them on tape." He wasn't bluffing. Before bed, I checked the motion sensor system, around 400 ohm. It tripped. The camera caught two men, plain clothes, one with a measuring wheel, the other holding a GPS pole. No headlights, no conversation. Just quiet, surgical precision, One of them wore a vest with the same logo printed on the stake stickers. They measured, noted, then walked off into the trees. In the morning, Grandpa watched the footage 3 times without saying a word. Then he called the sheriff. An hour later, we were sitting in the county office, going over the footage with a new face, an investigator from the State Environmental Division. He brought a folder of his own. Inside were photos from other properties, all within a 10-mile radius, all showing similar stakes, similar suspicious crews, and the same barely legal paperwork trails. They're testing boundaries, he said finally, laying the images side by side, pushing where they think no one's watching. Grandpa leaned back, lit a cigarette he hadn't planned to smoke, and let the silence hang. Then he said, "Well, they picked the wrong pasture." That night, while the rest of the county slept, Grandpa sat at the kitchen table, sketching on a notepad. I leaned over his shoulder and saw the layout fence lines, camera placements, solar lights. It looked more like a battle map than a ranch improvement plan. He handed me another pad and said, "Start measuring. I'm building a line they won't forget." And the next morning, before the rooster crowed, we started driving posts into the ground. The morning air was crisp, but Grandpa moved through it like it owed him something. The first post went in before the sun cleared the ridge, the sound of the sledgehammer echoing across the pasture like a starting gun. His rhythm was steady, unhurried, but not a second wasted. Each strike into the earth felt like punctuation in a sentence he'd been writing for 50 years, a message to anyone who thought the ranch was up for negotiation. I carried the wire rolls behind him, stumbling to keep pace. He didn't say much, but he didn't have to. The silence between us was thick with unspoken understanding we weren't building a fence. We were drawing a line in history. The new fence followed the old property boundaries but did it louder, stronger stakes. 3 layers of barbed wire, solar-powered motion lights mounted low, and hidden trail cameras watching from brush like silent witnesses. Grandpa had even printed new signs to hang every 30 feet. One read, "Private property. Trespassers will be photographed, documented, and introduced to the bull." Another said simply, "This land bites back." It wasn't just for show. Every inch of it screamed, "You may own paper, but we own the memory of this soil." Midway through driving the 5th post, the rumble of tires drifted across the field, not from the road, but from behind the distant tree line. Grandpa paused. He looked up and motioned for me to get low. We ducked behind the hay trailer, hearts pounding, listening. Through the tangle of branches, we spotted it, a black SUV with tinted windows rolling slow, deliberate, like a predator trying not to wake the herd. On the side door was a magnetic decal, Davidson Water Solutions. Out stepped Frank Davidson himself. Silver hair, clean vest, polished boots. He moved like a man who thought charm could substitute for permission. 2 other men followed, matching vests, clipboards, tablets. They moved down the line of old survey stakes, pointing, gesturing, stopping to check coordinates. Then Frank spread a folded sheet across the hood of his SUV, gesturing wide, like a conductor leading an orchestra. From this distance, I couldn't hear what he said, but his hands were drawing paths likely through our creek, through our cattle runs, through what he probably saw as empty acreage. That's when Grandpa stood up, calm, dust on his jeans, dirt on his hands, but straight-backed like a man walking into court. Not confrontation. He didn't shout. He didn't rush. He just walked. Frank turned, smile already in place, the kind of rehearsed expression politicians wear when they're about to lie. "Morning, Sam," he called. "Didn't expect to see you out this early. Didn't expect to see your boots on my creek bank." Grandpa replied. His voice was low, level, but it cut through the wind like a blade. "Last I checked, that water's mine, and this land is still private." Frank raised his hand slightly. "Mock surrender, just a little field, Yukon. No harm in checking future access points." "Right, I've got a proposal going to the board next month, just getting a head start." Grandpa kept walking. "Funny thing about starting early," he said, stopping a few feet from Frank. Sometimes you run into a wall you didn't expect. Frank's smile twitched. Barely. Sam, you and I both know the town's changing. These ranches, they're not forever. I'm offering a way forward, a partnership, value. You're offering lies with better printing. Grandpa said, you sent boys pretending to be officers, laid stakes without notice, and now you're here playing field boss on land that's not yours. One of Frank's men took a step forward, but Frank stopped him with a hand. That HOA business wasn't me. He said, must have been a subcontractor. Miscommunication, that's all. That miscommunication almost got winched into the river. Grandpa replied, and now you're standing on the same mud, hoping I won't call the sheriff again. Frank's voice lowered. Sam, be reasonable. You came here without a permit. Grandpa said, stepping closer, you sent fake agents, planted survey lines, and tried to sneak a pipeline under federal water rights. And now you're asking me to be reasonable. There was a long pause. Then Grandpa turned slightly, looked at me behind the trailer, and gave the smallest nod. I stood, camera in hand. I lifted it and began filming. Frank saw the lens and flinched, then turned his back to us like that would erase the footage. You're going to regret this, he muttered. There's momentum behind this. You can't hold it back forever. I don't have to. Grandpa said, I just have to make sure you trip on your own boots before you get too far. They left not long after, but not without leaving fresh tire ruts through the soft earth. That night, we finished the fence, every post set, every camera wired. Grandpa even added a remote gate lock he could control from his phone. A man who once called smartphones pocket sorcery, now reviewing security footage like a hawk with Wi-Fi. The next morning, a county vehicle pulled up. A man in a suit stepped out with a briefcase and introduced himself as a land records officer. He had a complaint in hand filed by Davidson, claiming our new fence encroached on a public utility corridor. Grandpa didn't blink. He walked the man to the creek, showed him the original deed, the water rights, and a fresh copy of the footage from the nighttime survey crew. The officer reviewed the file silently, then pulled out his own map. They never registered an easement. He said, no permit applications, no environmental survey, no notices filed. This complaint has no standing. That evening, county officials visited Davidson's field office. They didn't bring police cars, just clipboards and sharp eyes. What they found inside was enough to freeze every project under Davidson's name. Forged permits, fake access agreements, unauthorized expansions across multiple properties. No arrests? Not yet. But Frank Davidson's empire was no longer expanding. It was crumbling, one photocopied lie at a time. Back on the ranch, Grandpa didn't celebrate. He didn't boast. He pulled out a folding chair, set it by the creek, and sat there with a jar of sweet tea, watching the birds settle over the water. When I asked him if he thought they'd be back, he didn't answer right away. He just stared at the old survey stake leaning against the fence post, then said, maybe, but next time I won't bring a chain. I'll bring the law, and maybe a backhoe for good measure. 3 days after the officials raided Davidson's trailer office, things got quiet, but it wasn't the kind of peace that settles in after justice is done. It was the kind of silence that hangs over scorched earth, uneasy, watching, waiting for whatever comes next. Grandpa wasn't fooled by it. He moved slower, not because he was tired, but because he was listening. Listening to the wind at the creek bend, to the shift of birds in the trees, to the crackle of dry grass under unfamiliar boots. One morning just after sunrise, a black unmarked truck pulled up our gravel drive. Grandpa was already on the porch with a coffee in one hand and the trail cam monitor in the other. He didn't move as the driver stepped out, a tall, lean man in a pale government shirt and carrying a leather folder so worn it looked like it had survived more battles than its owner. The man introduced himself as a state environmental inspector sent in response to a formal complaint filed against us, something about unauthorized land alteration and disruption of future public utility access. Davidson's last gasp Grandpa didn't flinch. He just said, "Let's go to the barn." Inside the barn, behind a stack of dog-eared almanacs and a coffee tin full of mismatched nails, Grandpa had stashed a weathered plastic crate labeled Land War 1962 to now. Out came three sealed folders, the original creek access deed signed by his father's hand in fountain pen ink, a certified topographic map from '85 marking the natural waterway boundaries, and a legal boundary survey filed the year before, stamped and dated with enough bureaucratic ink to choke a small courthouse. Grandpa laid them out like a winning poker hand and looked the inspector straight in the eye. "Unless your complaint's based on fairy tales and imaginary pipes," he said, "I think we're done here." The inspector thumbed through the documents, each page slowing his pace. He asked sharp questions. Grandpa answered every one without looking at a note. Dates, filing numbers, signatures. The inspector eventually closed the folder and nodded. "Complaints thin," he admitted. "Very likely an attempt to delay or discredit. You'll get an official letter in a few days clearing your name." Grandpa didn't say thank you. He just tipped his hat and saw the man out. That evening, with the sun low and the light turning gold over the fields, Grandpa sat down with a fresh cup of coffee and started writing, not an email, not a memo, a letter, handwritten in blocky, deliberate strokes. It was addressed to the State Land Board, a formal request to open an investigation into recurring illegal survey activities on private ranch land. He listed every date, every stake pulled from our ground, every motion-activated timestamp from our trail cams. He included photos, printed out in black and white, but marked with a red pen. At the end, he attached a hand-drawn map, simple, but precise, showing the pattern of encroachment, the direction of the intended pipeline, and the names of witnesses, including the sheriff's deputy who had first responded. He folded the pages carefully and handed them to me. "Post office tomorrow," he said. "And swing by the co-op. We're going to need more wire." I left early the next morning with the letter, but I hadn't even cleared the gate when a county cruiser skidded onto the gravel. Deputy Keller stepped out fast, his boots still muddy from somewhere else. He looked grim. No smirk this time. "Is your grandpa home?" he asked. I nodded toward the porch, where Grandpa was already standing with arms folded. Keller climbed the steps quickly. "You'll want to hear this firsthand," he said. "Last night, another ranch 5 miles east caught two men digging along a stake line, no ID, no permits. They were laying prep lines for PVC, probably for water routing. They left behind fake HOA signs again." Grandpa didn't say a word. He turned around and walked into the house, emerging a minute later with a manila envelope full of notes, license plate numbers, and photos of every single stake we'd pulled from our land. "Give this to the prosecutor," he said, "and tell whoever's letting Davidson play outlaw developer that the next one who crosses my fence is getting charged for racketeering." Keller didn't argue. He nodded and left without another word. That afternoon, a young reporter from a regional paper showed up. Word had spread first through whispered calls between ranchers, then through emails, then over breakfast counters and co-op parking lots. She'd heard about the HOA truck in the creek, about the survey lines, about Davidson. Grandpa didn't want to talk. He hated attention. But eventually, he agreed to meet her by the new fence. She didn't ask easy questions, but he didn't give soft answers either. He told the truth that all it took to lose land these days wasn't a bulldozer. It was a clipboard, a fake badge, and the hope that folks were too tired to fight. This time, he said, they knocked on the wrong barn. The story ran on Sunday. It hit harder than we expected. The headline was bold: "Local rancher tows fake HOA into creek, uncovers land grab scam." The photo beneath it was perfect. Grandpa standing at the creek's edge, arms crossed, the white truck still visible behind him, half submerged like a monument to arrogance. Within days, emails flooded the sheriff's office. Other ranchers started digging near their own creeks. Survey stakes came up in half a dozen properties. What once looked like isolated incidents now looked like a coordinated campaign, quiet, calculated, and counting on silence. But the silence had broken. By the end of the week, The state froze every permit associated with Davidson Water Solutions. Their accounts were locked, their offices closed, equipment impounded. Investigators swarmed like wasps over every document in their filing cabinets. Grandpa watched it all unfold with the calm of a man who'd seen storms come and go, but had never let go of the fence post. The final letter came on a Friday. It was from the County Land Registry. Not only had Davidson's attempted corridor through our creek been revoked, but the legal boundary of our property had been updated officially, affirming a disputed patch near the south line as ours, permanently. Grandpa read the letter once, folded it, and slid it into his filing cabinet under a new tab labeled Victory. No cheers, no speeches, just a small nod to himself. Life returned to something like normal after all that, but it wasn't the same. The fence wasn't just a barrier anymore. It was a memory of what almost happened and what never would again. Grandpa still woke up before dawn, still fed the animals, still cursed the barn cat when it knocked over the feed bucket. But every time he passed the new fence, his eyes lingered a little longer. He didn't smile. Grandpa wasn't the smiling type, but the corner of his mouth tugged upward just enough to say, I remember, and I'm ready. One afternoon, while mending wire by the back slope, the trail pinged. It sent a live feed to Grandpa's phone, a new feature he'd resisted but quickly mastered. He tapped on the screen and held it up. Two unfamiliar men in button-ups and dusty jeans stood by the creek, looking. No truck, no clipboard, but the same calculating posture. They stood there a while, then took a photo and turned to leave. That was enough. Grandpa gave a sharp whistle. Within seconds, our two border collies thundered across the field, barking like thunder rolling down a canyon wall. The men scattered. The dogs didn't chase far, just enough to make the point. Grandpa turned to me and said, might be time for another sign. That evening, a call came in. Davidson had declared bankruptcy. His assets were frozen. Investigations were open fraud, misrepresentation, and environmental violations. He'd left town quietly. Some said west, others said overseas. Grandpa didn't care. But a week later, a package arrived in the mail. No return address, just our family name in red marker. Inside was a photo, an overhead drone shot of the creek bend. The new fence was visible, shining in the light. So was the truck, still rusted and half buried. At the bottom, in thick red letters, someone had written, we got the message. Grandpa didn't hang it, didn't frame it. He leaned it against the wall in the barn, next to the tool chest, like a strange trophy from a strange war. I asked him once if he thought it was a threat or surrender. He shrugged. Could be either. He said, doesn't matter. They won't be back. That night, he set up 2 lawn chairs by the creek, handed me a root beer. We sat in silence, watching the water slide over the rocks, slow and steady. You know, he said eventually, I don't build fences to keep people out. I build them to show where respect begins. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The creek gurgled beside us. The fence stood tall, and the memory of the white truck sat like a ghost in the shadows. Some fences are built with wood and wire. The best ones are built with memory. And out here, the land remembers.